He saw a tired nurse in wrinkled scrubs clutching old boots like she'd walked out of a shelter. He didn't see the tactical way her eye scanned the platform. He didn't see what 3 combat deployments had forged into muscle memory. Norfolk subway platform. 6:47 in the evening. Fluorescent lights flickered over cracked tile in a rhythm that made your teeth ache, and the air hung thick with brake dust and stale coffee that hadn't been fresh since the Clinton administration. Rachel Torres stood motionless near the far pillar in navy scrubs darkened with 12 hours of shift sweat, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a pair of worn combat boots, the leather cracked at the heel, laces frayed, the sole of the right boot separating from the upper like a mouth opening to speak. She'd promised the patient she'd repair them. A promise made in the trauma ward at 3 in the morning when the morphine was wearing off and an old man's hands shook as he placed them in hers. The commuters streamed past her like water around a stone. Nobody saw her. This was the gift and curse of the temporary nurse, invisible, interchangeable, temporary. Just another exhausted healthcare worker waiting for the train home. A faint scar ran along her left forearm, barely visible under the harsh lighting, thin as a whisper, old as regret. Her shoulders curved forward in a way that suggested apology, and her eyes stayed down on the boots cradled against her chest. Station manager Derek Paulson watched from his glass office window above the platform, 43 years old, his suit pressed sharp enough to cut, his expression arranged in the kind of civic authority that men like him mistook for competence. He leaned forward with his forearms on the desk, tracking movements below like a supervisor counting productivity. His desk held a framed photograph of him at some charity gala, mayor's hand on his shoulder. In the corner, a brass plaque from the Norfolk Business Council. Power was a language he spoke fluently. The crowd thickened as a train approached from the tunnel. He could feel it before he saw it, the pressure change in the air, the way the fluorescent lights dimmed just slightly as if the station itself was holding its breath. Commuters shifted their weight, repositioning toward the doors. Rachel adjusted her grip on the boots, fingers arranged with the kind of precision that suggested holding them was muscle memory from holding very different things. Hand steady as a surgical laser. Near the platform center sat an elderly man in a wheelchair, positioned dangerously close to the yellow safety line. His name was Garcia. He was 62 years old, ex-army medic, his hands trembling with a kind of palsy that comes from IED shrapnel that doctors still couldn't fully extract from his spinal cord. The tremors came in waves, sometimes barely noticeable, sometimes violent enough that he gripped the wheelchair's wheels to keep his hands from flying. He'd been coming to this platform 3 times a week for 6 years to sit in the natural light that came through the skylights at sunset, the only place that didn't smell like antiseptic or sound like monitors beeping themselves toward death. 3 teenagers circled him like sharks testing the water. They wore the uniform of privilege, sneakers that cost more than Garcia's monthly disability check, hoodies with logos from prep schools, the kind of casual cruelty that only comes from never being told no. The largest one, maybe 17, wore a backwards baseball cap and held his phone up, the camera already recording. His friends moved in tighter, their laughter arriving before their words, sharp and bright. "Yo, look at him shake," the one with the camera said. "Dude's literally vibrating." The second one, smaller, with expensive wireless earbuds dangling from his neck, began mimicking Garcia's tremors, exaggerating the shaking in his hands, his jaw rattling in parody. "BBB buddy, why you shaking so hard?" The third one stood closest, lanky, pale, with the kind of meanness in his eyes that usually came from being invisible at home and deciding to become visible everywhere else. He raised his hand in a mock military salute, sharp and mocking. "Captain Shaky here, gentlemen. Reporting for duty." The camera recorded it all. The platform, with its indifferent crowds, became a stage. Nobody stepped in. Nobody said a word. An older woman pulled her bag closer to her body and looked away. A businessman shifted his weight and found the ceiling interesting. The platform wasn't a community. It was a collection of isolated islands, each person protecting their own small shore from the tide. Paulson watched from his office window, his expression unchanged. He saw the mocking, the recording, the tremoring veteran at the center of the circle. He saw it clearly. His hand rested on the phone on his desk, one call to security would have dispersed them in 90 seconds. Instead, his eyes drifted down to a memo on his desk. The scholarship fund. He knew these boys' parents. Their fathers served on the Transit Authority's board. Their mothers funded the summer internship program. One complaint from them, one negative review, one hint that station management had interfered with their son's activities, and his position, his comfortable six-figure position, became negotiable. He shifted in his leather chair and went back to his email. Rachel saw it all happen in the space of 4 heartbeats. Her eyes came up from the boots, and something shifted behind them, not anger, not yet, but something that moved like a predator recognizing prey. She was already scanning the platform with the part of her brain that never fully left Tikrit, the part that never stopped calculating sight lines and exit routes and how many seconds it would take to move from point A to point B. The teenagers occupied the center. The train was arriving, she could feel the pressure change, see the tunnel lighting approaching. The crowd would compress. The vulnerable would stay vulnerable. Garcia's hands gripped the wheelchair wheels harder. His jaw clenched. The humiliation had a flavor, specific, poisonous, the taste of being seen as broken instead of as a person who'd been broken by service. He didn't look at the teenagers. He stared straight ahead at the approaching train lights, as if he could disappear into his own skin. The largest teenager raised his phone higher. The moment was crystallizing into something permanent, video, evidence, a story that would travel through their school and their friend groups and become legend. Captain Shaky. The viral moment. The joke that would follow Garcia through the grocery store, through the VA clinic, through the rest of his diminished life. Rachel Torres stood up straight. Her hands adjusted their grip on the combat boots, and for just a moment, the trembling stopped. Her shoulders rolled back. Her spine lengthened. The apology drained from her posture like water from a wound. She was still in scrubs, still anonymous, still just another tired healthcare worker. But something in the way she moved, the weight behind each step, the way her eyes fixed on a point with the kind of focus that suggested she'd done this before, done worse, under fire and at distance and in circumstances that would have broken most people, something changed the angle of the platform's light. She took a single step forward. Nobody saw her coming because nobody was looking for her. That was the thing about being invisible. Sometimes you could move through the world like a ghost, and by the time people noticed you, you were already inside the circle. The teenager with the camera was still filming, still grinning, when she appeared beside Garcia's wheelchair like she'd materialized from the fluorescent hum of the lights themselves. She didn't speak. Not yet. She simply positioned herself between the boys and the old man, a barrier, quiet and solid, the kind that didn't ask permission. The platform went so quiet you could hear the train approaching in the tunnel, the wheels on the rails, the sound of velocity carrying metal through darkness toward the light. The boys looked at her. Just some nurse. Some tired woman in scrubs. Replaceable. Temporary. Invisible. They had no idea who they were standing next to. Rachel set down her bag at the platform's edge and took one measured breath. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in pale institutional white, the teenagers in their varsity jackets, Garcia hunched in his wheelchair, the indifferent commuters streaming past like water around stones. She could read the moment perfectly. The largest teen, number 23 printed on his jacket, had just finished a salute so exaggerated it looked like a seizure. "Look, it's Captain Shaky," he'd announced to his friends, his phone already recording. The others laughed, one kneeling to get a better camera angle. "Broken soldier! Broken soldier," they chanted, their voices carrying the particular cruelty that comes from knowing nobody will stop them. Rachel walked directly into the circle. Not rushed. Not angry. Measured. She positioned herself between Garcia and the 3 boys, her body language pure shield. Her scrubs, still damp from a 14-hour shift at Mercy General, hung slightly loose on a frame that moved like someone who had memorized every tactical position. The teens didn't know what to do with her. Adults didn't usually do this. Adults looked away. She locked eyes with the varsity jacket kid, the one with the phone still recording. My father had those same shakes from Tikrit, Rachel said, her voice devastating in its calm, each word placed like rounds downrange. And he could still outshoot any one of you with his weak hand. A single tear escaped down her cheek, not from weakness, but from the precise pressure of holding something back, and she wiped it without breaking eye contact. The motion was so controlled it seemed mechanical, the tear treated like a minor malfunction in equipment that otherwise functioned perfectly. The three boys stepped back. Uncertainty flickered across Varsity Jacket's face. His phone dipped slightly. Then the office door opened. Station manager Derek Paulson descended the metal stairs with the certainty of a man who had never been questioned in his own domain. He was 48, built like someone who'd played college football and had been coasting on that memory ever since. His uniform was sharp. His bearing conveyed authority the way his tailored blazer conveyed money. He moved directly toward Rachel, and the speed of his descent told her everything about his calculation. She was the disruption, not the teenagers recording and chanting. "Step away from those passengers," he ordered, his voice carrying across the platform with the weight of institutional power. It wasn't a request. It was a command shaped like a transit authority letterhead. Rachel turned to face him. These boys were harassing. "I saw you insert yourself into a situation and create a disturbance," Paulson interrupted, already pulling out his citation pad. His pen was expensive, the kind that probably cost more than Rachel's entire lunch budget. "Those young men's parents are major donors to our scholarship fund. Any complaint from them could cost me my position." He didn't look at her, he looked through her, the way you look at a faulty system that needs documenting. "This is a citation for interfering with passengers." His pen scratched across the official transit authority letterhead with sharp, emphatic strokes. The sound carried across the platform like a prosecutor marking evidence. Rachel watched the citation take shape, her name, the alleged offense written in bureaucratic precision, the line where he'd already decided the outcome. The other commuters had become intensely interested in their phones. A woman in a grey coat turned completely away. A man in a suit accelerated toward the opposite platform as if he'd forgotten something urgently important. The three teenagers high-fived silently, their recording finished, their work complete. Paulson tore the citation from the pad and handed it to Rachel with the satisfied expression of a man who had solved a problem using the correct institutional procedure. His fingers didn't touch hers, the citation simply transferred, a transaction rather than a human exchange. Rachel took it. Her jaw tightened. Not trembling. Not flexing with anger. Just tightening, the way a joint tightens before executing a practiced maneuver. Garcia, watching from his wheelchair in the corner where the teens had left him, waited until Paulson had turned away. His voice, when it came, was barely audible, the whisper of someone who recognized something nobody else on this platform would ever see. "You move like you've done triage under fire." It wasn't a question. It was confirmation. Rachel's head turned slightly toward him. Paulson's eyes flicked between them, suddenly registering that there was a connection here, a familiarity, something happening beneath the surface of the platform's ordinary evening transit rhythm. His hand went back to his vest instinctively, some part of him sensing that he'd just written a citation for something he didn't understand. "Both of you, disperse." "Now," Paulson said, and there was something in his voice now that wasn't authority, it was the sound of a man who suddenly suspected he'd missed something crucial and didn't have the framework to process it. Rachel helped Garcia adjust his blanket with movements that carried absolute dignity. She tucked the corners with precision, her fingers gentle but efficient, each motion exact. Then she picked up her bag. The pair of worn combat boots tumbled out slightly as she lifted it, the one she'd promised to repair, the ones her father had worn in Tikrit, the one she'd been carrying like a memory made physical. She caught them before they fell completely, held them against her chest for a moment, then secured them in her bag. The three teenagers were already walking away, laughing, already pulling up their recording on one of their phones. Paulson watched from his office window as Rachel stood on the platform with Garcia's wheelchair beside her, the citation clutched in her hand. He watched long enough to wonder if he'd made a mistake. Then he returned to his desk. Rachel didn't go home. She went back to Mercy General instead. There were charts to review, patients who'd been waiting for her to sign off on their discharge paperwork, a 14-hour shift that had somehow turned into 17 hours before anyone realized it. The citation stayed in her locker, tucked behind her second pair of scrubs, a small piece of official letterhead documenting the moment she'd chosen visibility over survival. The next morning, she arrived at Norfolk Station again because the route was efficient and because she refused to be displaced by bureaucratic cowardice. She was carrying the repaired boots in her bag, the laces new, the leather conditioned, ready to return them to Garcia as promised. The platform was quieter in the morning, fewer commuters, fewer phones, fewer reasons to look away. That's when the shouting started near the turnstiles. She heard it first as a sound, not words, but the acoustic signature of a body failing. A thud. The specific quality of an impact that meant medical crisis. Rachel's head came up. Her sensory processing shifted instantly, moving from civilian to operational. Every nerve ending suddenly calibrated for information. Station manager Derek Paulson was collapsed on the ground behind the fare gates, his face the color of old concrete, his lips turning blue at the edges like someone had drawn them with cyanide. His chest heaved irregularly, not breathing, gasping, the sound of a respiratory system in rebellion. One hand clutched his sternum, fingers splayed across his ribs as if he could hold his own chest together by force of will. Rush hour crowd streamed past. Some glanced down. Most averted their eyes entirely with the practiced skill of people who had learned that public suffering was not their responsibility. A teenager took a photo, then kept walking. Nobody stopped. Nobody knelt. Nobody called for help. Rachel dropped everything. Her bag hit the platform. The combat boots tumbled out, the newly repaired laces trailing like they were reaching for something. She was already moving, her body responding faster than her mind could articulate the decision. She dropped to her knees beside Paulson, her fingers going to his neck, carotid artery, checking for pulse. There. Rapid. Thready. Weakening. She ripped open his shirt with the confident violence of someone who had done this more than once. Buttons scattered across the platform. She ripped the undershirt beneath it and pressed her ear to his chest, listening for the heartbeat beneath the ribs. Muffled heart sounds. Distended jugular veins, she muttered, her voice shifting into something entirely different, clinical, authoritative, the voice of someone who had been trained by the United States military to function when everything else failed. Cardiac tamponade. Fluid building around the heart, compressing it, minutes from lethal arrest. She'd seen it before. She'd fixed it before. And every single time, the clock was running. Her medical bag was across the platform. She yelled for someone to bring it. No one moved. Garcia, sitting in his wheelchair in the corner where he always sat, suddenly understood. His hands began moving, old, shaking, but purposeful. He wheeled himself forward with more speed than his tremors should have allowed, reached Rachel's bag with remarkable accuracy despite the tremor that ran through his shoulders, and threw it to her. She caught it without looking. "Sir, stay with me," she ordered Paulson, her tone pure command authority. There was no please in it. There was no deference. There was only the sound of someone who had given orders that other people's lives depended on, and those people had followed them, and they were still alive because of it. Her hands moved. Muscle memory took over, or muscle knowledge, because this wasn't memory, it was engraved into her nervous system so deeply that her conscious mind was almost a passenger to her own competence. She located the insertion point below his sternum, swabbed with alcohol in one smooth motion, and performed an emergency pericardiocentesis with the kind of precision that comes from having done exactly this kind of procedure exactly this many times when the patient in front of you was bleeding out and your hands were the only thing keeping them conscious. The needle slid between ribs. There was resistance, the pericardium, and then the specific sensation of breakthrough. The syringe drew back dark fluid, and the moment it started flowing, Paulson's color changed. Not dramatically. Just notably. His gasping decreased. His chest stopped heaving. His eyes, which had been rolling toward white, refocused on the face above him. Garcia watched every movement, his expression shifting from concern to recognition to something that looked like understanding dawning across his features like sunrise. He'd seen this before too. He knew what this was. He knew what kind of training produced hands that moved like this, with this precision, with this absolute absence of hesitation. 6 minutes later, paramedics arrived to find Paulson breathing steadily, conscious, staring up at Rachel with confusion and something approaching fear. They took over without asking questions, just nodded at her, the way you nod at someone who clearly knew what they were doing. Rachel stood up. She picked up her bag. The combat boots went back inside. "I'm going on break," she said to no one in particular, her voice dropping back to the register of a temp nurse who'd just helped a manager with a minor medical issue. Nothing more. Nothing less. She didn't look at Garcia. She didn't look at Paulson. She walked toward the far end of the platform where the morning light came through the upper windows, and she stood there for exactly 47 seconds, breathing, her hand steady as surgical steel, understanding exactly what she had just revealed and exactly what that meant for the carefully constructed invisibility she'd been maintaining for the past 8 months. By afternoon, everything had changed. 2 days later, Rachel stepped onto the Norfolk subway platform during evening rush hour, the repaired combat boots wrapped in brown paper and tucked inside her bag like a secret. The platform hummed with the energy of 6 o'clock commuters, briefcases and phone screens and the distant rumble of an arriving train. She was walking toward the far end of the platform when she heard it. A sound like a body hitting tile. Like air leaving lungs that weren't refilling. Derek Paulson lay behind the turnstiles, his body contorted against the metal barrier, his lips the color of bruised plums. His chest heaved irregularly, desperate gasps that weren't moving air the way lungs should move air. His face had the waxy pallor of someone whose heart was working backward, pushing blood nowhere, accomplishing nothing. Rachel's training recognized it before her conscious mind caught up. The way his neck veins distended. The way his skin mottled blue and gray. The way his eyes had gone wide with the specific terror of someone drowning in his own chest. Cardiac tamponade. Blood filling the pericardial sac around his heart like a fist slowly closing. Commuters flowed around him like water around a stone. A woman in a grey suit glanced down, then away. A man with earbuds stepped over his legs. No one stopped. No one knelt. The platform's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with the sound of electricity burning through vacuum, and the only person moving toward Derek Paulson was Rachel, who dropped to her knees beside him with the fluid efficiency of someone who had done this before on concrete floors in Tikrit where the air smelled like diesel exhaust and cordite and blood. "Can you hear me?" she asked. Her voice had dropped into the register that came from somewhere deep, somewhere trained. The voice of someone who had held lives together with her hands while rounds came in from 3 directions. Paulson's eyes rolled toward hers. His mouth opened. No words came. Rachel's hands moved on their own. Not hesitation. Not doubt. Just the muscle memory of 18 years compressed into pure motion. She reached into her medical bag, the one she carried always, the one that had saved 7 people on a FOB in Helmand Province, and withdrew a sterilized 18-gauge needle, plastic-cased, still wrapped. Her fingers were steady as surgical steel as she felt for the landmarks on his chest. The second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The angle of Louis like a map her hands had memorized years ago. "This will help you breathe," she said quietly, and then she moved the needle through skin and muscle and the taut membrane of the pericardium. The hiss of air escaping. Blood seeped around the needle. Dark red. Pressurized. The needle was doing what it was designed to do, creating a pathway for the fluid crushing his heart to escape, to release the pressure, to give his left ventricle room to beat again. She could feel the resistance leave his chest. His breathing became less frantic. Not better. Not yet. But less like drowning. The needle stayed steady in her hands while commuters continued to stream past, nobody noticing, everybody seeing, all of them choosing to look at their shoes instead of at the woman on her knees performing a procedure that existed in a very small space between life and death. From his usual corner of the platform, Garcia watched. The old veteran sat in his wheelchair with his trembling hands folded in his lap, and as Rachel performed the pericardiocentesis with the precision of someone who had done it under fire, his hands went very still. His eyes locked onto her movements. The way she controlled the needle. The way she knew where to go without hesitation. The way her breathing never changed. He had seen competence before. He had trained beside it. He had fought beside it. And he recognized it now with the certainty of a man who had spent 40 years around the best soldiers the Navy ever made. The ambulance arrived within 8 minutes. The paramedics loaded Paulson onto a stretcher. His color was returning. His breathing was almost normal. His vital signs had stabilized to something that resembled survival. Rachel stepped back and let them work, her hands at her sides, her expression neutral as stone. As the ambulance pulled away from the platform with its lights strobing red and white against the evening sky, Rachel turned and saw Paulson through the rear window. Watched him reach for his phone. Watched him grip it with shaking fingers. Watched his mouth move. She knew exactly what he was doing. She had saved his life, and the first thing he was doing was making calls. Garcia wheeled up beside her. The platform had emptied now, the evening commuters dispersed into the city above them. The noise of the subway faded to the humming electrical baseline of the station's infrastructure, the ventilation system exhaling stale air, the fluorescent lights buzzing their endless frequency, the distant rumble of another train in the tunnel. "He's not thanking you," Garcia observed quietly. His voice carried the weight of 70 years and 40 of them spent in uniform. "No," Rachel said. By the next morning, the Transit Authority's legal department had filed paperwork. By 9 a.m., 2 investigators in grey suits arrived at Mercy General, where Rachel was finishing the last hour of a temporary shift covering the urgent care clinic. They found her restocking the medication cart in the supply room, her movements efficient and practiced, her presence taking up no more space than a shadow. "Ms. Rachel Torres," the first investigator asked. His name tag said Morrison. The second investigator didn't introduce himself. They never did. "Yes," Rachel said. She set down the inventory sheet. Her jaw tightened but nothing else changed. "We need to speak with you regarding an incident at Norfolk subway station on the evening of June 14th. Morrison pulled out a notebook. "Station manager Derek Paulson has filed a formal complaint. He's alleging that you performed medical procedures without authorization and that you committed assault." Rachel's face went very still. Not pale. Not flushed. Just absent, like someone had closed a door inside her. "I saved his life. He had cardiac tamponade. The pericardial sac was—" "We're aware of the medical details," Morrison interrupted. "Mr. Paulson isn't disputing that. What he's disputing is your authority to perform that procedure. He wants to know what credentials you held at the time of the incident." "I'm a registered nurse. Temporary assignment through Mercy General. We'll need your nursing license, your employment records, and your military service documentation." The second investigator pulled out a laptop. Morrison made a call. Within 20 minutes, Rachel sat in the Human Resources office while they ran her file. The terminal hummed. The cursor blinked. The screen showed nothing. No military records. No service history. No training certifications. No deployment records. Nothing. Blank. Deleted. Erased. The classified operation in Tikrit that officially never happened had been scrubbed so completely that even the paperwork admitting she existed in that theater had been incinerated. She had been ordered to disappear, and the Pentagon had done exactly what it promised, made her vanish, even from herself. No record of Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres. No record of her 12 years. No record of the 3 tours. No record of the 2 Purple Hearts or the Bronze Star hidden in her apartment or the Navy Cross locked in a safe deposit box with her husband's wedding ring. "I served," she said quietly. "I can explain." "Without documentation, you have no proof of medical authority," Morrison said. "Mr. Paulson's attorney is discussing criminal charges. Practicing medicine without a license. Assault with a medical instrument. Unauthorized medical intervention in a public space. Dr. Hargrove, the hospital administrator, appeared in the doorway with the expression of someone who had been waiting for this moment the way a vulture waits for a carcass to stop moving. Ms. Torres, I'm going to have to suspend you effective immediately. Until this matter is resolved with law enforcement, you cannot work at Mercy General in any capacity. Please return your badge. Rachel unfastened her badge from her scrubs. It clattered against the tile floor with the sound of finality. She set it on the desk. Her hands didn't shake. I saved a man's life yesterday, she said very quietly. I knew he would destroy me for it. I saved him anyway. That's the part you need to understand. I knew exactly what would happen, and I did it because it was the right thing to do. No one answered. The investigators exchanged glances. Morrison made a note in his book. Hargrove turned away. Rachel gathered her belongings, the repaired combat boot still wrapped in brown paper, her personal items, the small photo of her husband she'd kept on the supply room shelf. She walked out of Mercy General and didn't look back. The cemetery was grey under evening rain, the headstones dark and wet, the grass the color of old money. Rachel stood in front of Michael's grave with the combat boots clutched to her chest like they were something alive that might escape. The rain came down in sheets, hammering the earth, and she knelt in the mud without caring that her scrubs were soaking through, that her knees were sinking into earth that had already taken so much. I finally surfaced, she whispered to the headstone. After 8 months of hiding. After 8 months of being invisible. I showed them what I could do, and now I'm more erased than ever. The Pentagon deleted me, but at least they did it quietly. At least no one knew. Now everyone knows I'm nothing. No credentials. No authority. Just a temp nurse who practiced medicine without a license. Rain streamed down her face, and she made no move to wipe it away. I failed. Michael. I'm sorry. I failed at being invisible, and now I'm failing at everything else. The rain continued. The city hummed somewhere above the cemetery, distant and indifferent. And in that moment, with the boots of a soldier she'd promised to help still clutched to her chest, Rachel Torres was more alone than she had been in 8 months. But that wasn't the worst part. The investigators sat across from Rachel in the Transit Authority's basement office, fluorescent overhead panels casting everything in institutional white. 2 of them, both wearing the kind of pressed shirts that suggested administrative work rather than field experience. Rachel's hands rested flat on the table, one thumb still bearing the faint callus from years of gripping surgical instruments under pressure. You're saying you're a temporary nurse, the first investigator said, his pen hovering over a legal pad. Covering shifts at the VA clinic. That correct? Yes, Rachel said. Seasonal contract. 12 weeks. Renewable. And your credentials? On file with the VA Employment Office. I can provide the contact number. The second investigator was already typing. Rachel watched his expression shift from skepticism to confusion to something approaching alarm. He turned his laptop toward his partner. Both of them stared at the screen in silence that stretched like a rope pulled too tight. Your file, the first investigator said slowly, comes back blank. Rachel's jaw tightened. Not a flinch. Not even a blink. Just that single muscle contraction along her cheekbone, the kind of tell only someone trained to read combat stress would recognize. What do you mean blank? She asked, her voice steady as a metronome. I mean, the second investigator said, turning the laptop back, there is no Rachel Torres in the VA system. No Social Security employment record. No W-4s. No background check on file. Nothing. It's like you don't exist in any federal employment database. Rachel had known this was coming. She had always known. The moment she'd performed that pericardiocentesis on the platform, the moment Paulson's eyes had registered recognition of something beyond a simple medical procedure, she had known. Classified operations in Tikrit had a way of staying classified. The Pentagon didn't erase records by accident. Request a manual review, Rachel said. The files are sealed. There's a clearance required. Call the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency. Ask for the Special Access Programs Office. The investigators exchanged a look. The kind of look that suggested they had never in their careers had to contact the DCSA. You understand what you're asking us to do, the first investigator said. I understand what I'm not asking you to do, Rachel replied. I'm not asking you to let me go. I'm not asking you to protect me. I'm asking you to verify that my credentials exist in a system you don't have clearance to access. 3 hours later, after phone calls and hold times and conversations with people whose titles Rachel could have predicted with her eyes closed, the investigators returned. Hargrove, the station manager, had filed a formal complaint with the Transit Authority's legal department. The attorneys had forwarded it to the city. The city had forwarded it to state prosecutors. Somewhere in that chain, someone had decided that attempting to locate Rachel's records was not worth the bureaucratic hassle. The first investigator slid a piece of paper across the desk. A suspension notice. Effective immediately. Pending investigation. No pay. No benefits. No contact with VA personnel or facilities. You're to remain available for questioning, the investigator said. You don't leave the city without notifying us. Rachel stood. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else. That evening, she drove to Harbor View Cemetery, the rain coming down like shrapnel, the kind of rain that sounded like something alive trying to break through the windshield. She parked and walked uphill through mud that clung to her boots like accusation. The headstone was simple. James Morrison Torres. 1982 to 2022. The inscription said nothing about the 18 months of chemotherapy, nothing about the medical bills that had drained their savings, nothing about the fact that he had believed in her when believing in her meant believing in a ghost. Rachel knelt in the rain, the combat boots still in her hands. She had been repairing them for 2 weeks now, replacing the laces, polishing out scratches, preparing them for a purpose she hadn't articulated even to herself. They had belonged to a young soldier once, someone Garcia had known, someone Garcia had carried out of a firefight in Tikrit. Rachel had promised to restore them. I've surfaced, she said to the headstone, to the rain, to the ground. After 8 months of being nobody, of working doubles and nights and staying invisible, I surfaced. One person needed help. One moment. And I couldn't stay hidden anymore. She pressed the boots against her chest, and her voice dropped to something raw. And it cost everything. Your name on this stone. My career. My future. All of it, gone. Because I couldn't watch an old man be broken by children and do nothing. The rain hammered the headstone like applause for a performance nobody wanted to see. The next morning, Rachel returned to the Norfolk subway station. She didn't know why, exactly. Habit. Penance. Some quiet need to stand in the place where everything had fractured and not run from it. She stood on the platform near the turnstiles, hands at her sides, waiting for something she couldn't name. Transit police arrived at 8:48 a.m. 2 officers, both of them young enough that they probably hadn't been on the force when Rachel was hiding in her apartment, when the entire eastern seaboard had believed she was dead. One of them had the kind of jawline that looked like it had been carved from certainty. The other was built like someone who had never been told no. They approached with a purpose that suggested paperwork had already been filed, signatures had already been obtained, and all that remained was the mechanical action of restraint. Rachel Torres, the first officer asked, though he clearly already knew the answer. Yes, Rachel said. Behind them, Derek Hargrove emerged from the station manager's office. His arm was still in a sling from the fall line, his face bearing the particular shade of grey that came from being dead for approximately 90 seconds before someone brought you back. His eyes found Rachel and locked on with the kind of intensity that suggested he had spent his entire recovery planning this moment. That's her, Hargrove confirmed, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who had finally found leverage. Rachel Torres, you're being detained for practicing medicine without authorization and unlawful assault. Rachel didn't move. Didn't flinch. didn't do anything except take one measured breath and stand perfectly still as commuters began to slow, forming a watching circle on the platform like water drawing toward a stone. She had been detained before. The specifics changed. The sensation never did. The officer reached for his belt, and that's when Garcia's wheelchair moved. It wasn't fast. Wheelchairs couldn't be fast. But Garcia moved the chair directly into the path between Rachel and the officers with the kind of precision that suggested he had visualized this moment more than once. He looked up at Rachel from the angle of someone staring into the face of someone they had been trying to place for weeks, and he said one word. Reaper. The platform went silent. Not the quiet of a moment passing. The quiet of a held breath, of air catching in collective lungs, of sound itself ceasing to exist in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Garcia rolled his wheelchair directly into the path of the transit police, his movement sudden and decisive, blocking the 2 officers who'd been positioning themselves on either side of Rachel with zip-tie restraints already in hand. The old veteran's hands gripped the chair wheels with surprising strength, and his voice, when it came, was a single word that stopped the entire platform cold. Reaper. The officers froze. Rachel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she didn't move. She didn't blink. Commuters who'd been rushing past suddenly slowed, sensing the shift in air pressure, the way the fluorescent lights above seemed to hum louder in the absence of movement. Garcia's grown daughter, a woman in her mid-40s wearing a hospital ID badge, stepped forward from the gathering crowd, her voice shaking as she addressed the transit officers. Senior Chief Petty Officer. The words landed like rounds into concrete. Rachel turned to look at Garcia's daughter, and for the first time since the police had arrived, something flickered across her face, not fear, not surprise, but recognition. The daughter continued, her hands trembling slightly as she held up her phone. A VA nurse who'd been passing through the station, heading toward the orange line, stopped mid-stride and pulled up a file on her screen, her movements urgent now. She scrolled through pages that glowed blue in the afternoon light, and when she began reading aloud, her voice trembled with the weight of what the words meant. 3 combat deployments. Tikrit, 2009 to 2012. Emergency Medical Technician Certification. Advanced Trauma Protocols. Classified Operation Designation. She stopped, looking up from the phone at Rachel. Your records were sealed by the Pentagon. The entire file is redacted except the basics, but it's all there. You're not just a nurse. You never were. The crowd had grown now. 30, maybe 40 people, all watching. All listening. The transit officers looked at each other, uncertainty flickering across their faces. They'd been given clear orders to detain Rachel Torres pending investigation, but something had shifted on this platform, something the paperwork hadn't accounted for. Then the turnstile burst open and a man in his 60s pushed through, broad-shouldered despite the years, wearing a Navy SEAL cap that looked weathered by salt water and time. Commander Brett Lawson, retired. His presence moved like a current through the crowd, and when he spoke, he addressed the transit officers with the kind of authority that didn't need to be loud. I'm retired Naval Special Warfare Command. That woman right there pulled my team out of an ambush in Tikrit in 2011. We were pinned down for 4 hours. 2 men bleeding out. She performed field surgery under fire with shrapnel coming through the walls. She earned a Navy Cross. 2 Bronze Stars. A Purple Heart that she never wore publicly because the entire operation was classified and buried so deep that the Pentagon erased her official records to protect operational security. Lawson stepped closer to Rachel, and his hand came to rest on her shoulder with the weight of someone who'd stood in the same fire. She was ordered to disappear. To walk away from the Navy, from her service record, from everything that identified her as who she actually was. So she became a temp nurse in a subway station, pushing a cart, taking abuse from people who had no idea they were standing next to a legend. And this station manager, he turned to look at where Paulson would have been, but Paulson wasn't there anymore, which meant the doors to the main platform entrance swung open and an FBI agent in a dark suit emerged from the crowd, his badge already visible, held with the kind of calm that suggested this was the culmination of something much larger than a subway platform. Agent Morrison, the nameplate read. He looked directly at the transit officers, then at Rachel, and his expression carried the weight of bureaucratic precision meeting human vindication. Derek Paulson is under federal arrest. He attempted to access and forge military service records through unauthorized databases yesterday afternoon to manufacture evidence that would discredit Ms. Torres and strengthen his assault complaint against her. The forgery was detected by automated security systems because his access was flagged as anomalous, unusual access patterns for someone in his position. When we investigated why a transit station manager was trying to breach classified military databases, we uncovered something much larger. Morrison produced a tablet, turning it so the transit officers could see the screen. They leaned forward, reading, their faces draining of color. Derek Paulson has been inflating maintenance contracts on behalf of 3 major vendors for the past 18 months. He's pocketed approximately $847,000 in kickbacks. When you filed your complaint against Ms. Torres, you triggered additional scrutiny into authorization protocols. That scrutiny exposed his financial irregularities. He panicked. He tried to discredit a potential witness, you, by manufacturing evidence that you had no medical credentials and therefore your observations during his cardiac collapse were inadmissible. He was trying to use a federal crime to cover up a federal crime. The tap of handcuffs sounded across the platform like a closing door. Officers emerged from the crowd, federal agents, not transit police, and Paulson was led toward the exit, his face the color of old concrete, his legs barely holding him upright. He tried to speak, but Morrison cut him off with a single raised hand. Derek Paulson, you're under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement of public funds, conspiracy to commit fraud, and attempted falsification of federal military records. You have the right to remain silent. The perp walk. 200 commuters watched as Paulson was guided through the turnstiles, every phone camera recording, every eye following. The man who'd written Rachel a citation for interfering with passengers was now the one being interfered with, detained, processed, removed from the normal world and fed into the machinery of federal prosecution. Garcia wheeled himself next to Rachel, and she stood perfectly still, accepting the closeness without moving. Beside her, Commander Lawson's hand remained steady on her shoulder. A single tear escaped down Rachel's cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She let it sit there, visible and acknowledged, because hiding was over now. The mask had been removed, and what remained underneath was something the platform had already recognized, a woman who'd lived in shadows by order, who'd served without recognition, who'd saved lives while scrubbing floors and pushing carts and accepting humiliation because the alternative was exposure. The 3 teenagers from 2 days ago, the ones who'd mocked Garcia, who'd recorded him with their phones, were at the far end of the platform. They'd watched the entire thing unfold. The largest one, the one Rachel had locked eyes with when she stood between him and the old veteran, approached slowly. His friends hung back, uncertainty written across their faces. When he was close enough to speak, his voice was barely a whisper. "We're sorry. We didn't know who you were. We didn't know about any of this." Rachel looked at him with the quiet dignity that came from having survived things that would break most people. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady and measured. "You didn't need to know. You needed to see a person who needed protection. That was enough." The teenager nodded, shame written into his posture, and turned to Garcia. "Sir, I'm sorry. For what we did. For recording you. For mocking you." Garcia accepted the apology with a single nod. The other 2 teenagers came forward, offering their own words. Garcia nodded for each one. And in that moment, on that platform in Norfolk, something shifted in the way the world worked. The system had found its balance again, accountability had become visible, and the quiet person who'd been underestimated had been recognized. 6 months later, Rachel's office at Mercy General VA Hospital bore a plaque on the door, Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres, USN, Ret, Combat Medical Specialist. Inside, on a memorial shelf beside her late husband's photograph, sat her father's combat boots. She'd spent weeks repairing them, oiling the leather, stitching the seams, working the toes back to shape. They sat there now like a monument to service, to sacrifice, to the things that were passed down through families who understood that some wounds never fully healed. Next to the boots lay a framed letter from Garcia, handwritten in careful script. You taught me that bravery looks quiet. That heroes don't announce themselves. That the person who stands in front of you when you're afraid is the only voice that matters. Thank you for standing in front of me. Thank you for being the nurse I needed. Rachel wore her dog tags outside her scrubs now. She'd earned the right. The 3 teenagers worked at the VA twice a week, volunteering, wheeling veterans to appointments and tests. The largest one had become Garcia's personal assistant during visits. Derek Paulson sat at a folding table outside a strip mall 15 miles away, selling supplemental transit insurance to pedestrians who walked past without stopping. His conviction had carried 3 years supervised release and permanent ban from public sector employment. His hands, which had once wielded the authority of institutional power, now held flyers that nobody wanted. Garcia rolled into Rachel's office on a Tuesday afternoon, a smile crossing his weathered face. Saw Paulson at the strip mall yesterday. Tried to sell me insurance. I told him I was already covered, by people who actually give a damn. They shared a quiet laugh, the sound of it echoing through the hallway outside. As Garcia wheeled out, Rachel returned to her paperwork, glancing at the photograph of her husband. I surfaced, Michael. I'm still standing. Outside her window, the Norfolk skyline glowed in afternoon light. A young veteran with a prosthetic leg walked past her door and Rachel called out, Need anything, Marine? He grinned. No, Senior Chief. Just wanted to say thanks for the assist yesterday. She nodded, and returned to her work, the work of healing, of witnessing, of standing between the broken and the world that had tried to break them. If you needed a reminder that the quietest people in the room often carry the heaviest responsibility, if you've ever been underestimated only to surface as something unstoppable, subscribe and comment below. Tell us, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong?